Welcome to the second year of the History of Science seminar series at the Institute for Advanced Study. I was able to be a miser, so I took some of the money from last year, nicely granted by our director, Robert Dijkgraaf, and was able to apply it to bring in, and I got an extra freebie. So we have 4 more people coming in, not 3 more people. We'll be updating you as is. The next talk will be in 3 weeks, and that's Christopher Phillips working on big data on the October 22nd, but we'll advertise that in advance. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce today our speaker. I want to extend a warm welcome to Professor Adelheid Heidi Voskuhl. For those of you who've been here longer than I, which would be a vast majority of the people in this room, we'll be welcoming back Heidi, because Heidi was a member here of the School of Historical Studies in 2012-2013. After spending a number of years at Harvard in the History of Science department, she is now an associate professor of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Heidi has a master's degree, Master's of Science degree in physics from Oldenburg, Universität Oldenburg in Germany, and where she worked with our friend Falk Ries. Then she received her Master's of Philosophy in History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge University, where she worked with a friend of ours, Simon and my Doktorvater, Simon Schaffer, and she received her PhD from Cornell University, working with Peter Deer, I believe, right? While a member here, she was working on a book which is now very much published. It is a very important book called Androids in the Enlightenment. Machines, Artisans and Cultures of the Self, University of Chicago Press, 2013. It received the Jacques Bazin Prize in Cultural History of the American Philosophical Society a year later in 2014. As you can see, she's now working on a different topic, which is equally fascinating, I think. By the way, I highly recommend the book. It's very important. If you're interested in machines and automata, Androids in the Enlightenment is a very, very important book in our field. She's now working on theories of technology, the Second Industrial Revolution, German idealism, and the social order during the Weimar Republic. Her talk today, Engineering Philosophy, Machine Culture, and Social Intellectual Elites in the Second Industrial Revolution. Please welcome back Heidi.
Thank you, Miles, for this very, very generous welcome back. In fact, just walking around here, I just had tea with Katja, just walking around this building, brought back so many memories. Yeah, I've said hello to Heinrich, to Glenn. Yeah, it's wonderful to be back. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Miles. And thanks for being here. Yeah, I've been working on my next book-size project on engineers, class, and the philosophy of technology. It's moving forward very slowly and sometimes backward, as some in this room know. And today, I'd like to touch on a few larger aspects of the book, just a few snapshots of where I am. And I thank you in advance for bearing with me. This is still very much a collection of thoughts. That's at least how it feels to me that I'm trying to stitch together currently. I'll first do a close reading of a text by Friedrich Engels called Principles of Communism, published in 1847. It preceded the longer and much better known Communist Manifesto that he co-authored with Karl Marx, that was published in 1848, a year later. And the Principles of Communism was to some degree the foundation of the manifesto. Engels' Principles of Communism is an exemplar of a very specific narrative, certainly not the only one, not even the first narrative of its kind, but in its own way very influential. It's a narrative on the emergence of a specific type of social stratification in the process of industrialization, which ended up mattering to many people all the way to this day. I will then outline some details on medieval and early modern Europe, and then discuss how a certain set of narratives about the past, such as Friedrich Engels's, was engaged, used, and produced, among others, by engineers in the Second Industrial Revolution in the context of engineers' concerns about social status. The so-called Second Industrial Revolution is usually dated from about 1870 to about 1930, give and take. It was during this time that engineers were trying to establish themselves as a new profession and new social and cultural elite. And doing so, engineers found themselves in often fierce competition with traditional social and academic elites. Traditional elites came from the nobility and the military, the free professions, law and medicine. They came from the pure sciences, physics and chemistry, and from the upper echelons of the civil service and the state administration, and in many countries that included the clergy and university professors. And such traditional dignitaries claimed their status, among other things, by tracing their roots back to pre-industrial, early modern, and even medieval times and social orders. And these traditional academic elites called engineers parvenus, social climbers, or arrivistes. The United States and Germany, and to some degree France, were the leading countries of the Second Industrial Revolution. It's called the Second Industrial Revolution to distinguish it from the first one, which is usually the much better known one. The First Industrial Revolution originated in England around 1780 and famously revolved around coal and iron ore, the steam engine, and the automation of the textile industry. The Second Industrial Revolution, about 80 to 100 years later, revolved around an entirely different set of technologies: electricity, chemistry, steel and concrete, and of course the internal combustion engine. And historians of technology emphasize how important it is to keep in mind that the technologies that were in use on the eve of the First World War were completely different from those that had been in use around 1850. It was new systems, it was new types of expertise necessary to build and maintain these systems, and it was an entirely new experience of industrialization within barely 1.5 generations. And people at the time knew this, and they expressed it in political, cultural, and artistic ways. The term modernism is one of several terms that has been used to capture this expression of a new experience of industrialization around 1900. Kathy Geer has taken a stab at defining the term. She notes that it is, of course, highly contested. That's also the very nature of modernism, to contest things. And Geer says that a consensus seems to have emerged recently that modernism denotes a distinctive and often self-conscious sense of generational crisis, beginning around 1870 and persisting until just before the Second World War. Other standard definitions of modernism include the idea that there was a loss of confidence in rationalism and in classical liberalism during this period, both of which had experienced heydays in the 18th century during the Enlightenment in Europe. Modernism rejected at the political level the liberal tradition that privileged the rational, autonomous subject as the main unit of political and moral reasoning. And what matters to me also is that modernism rejected aspects of classical liberalism and of early bourgeois society that were, after all, pre-industrial modernities. They featured characteristics that we now define as profoundly modern, for better or worse, and often tautologically, but these are features of modernity that came into being before industrialization, and that meant that they needed to be grappled with, sometimes in terms of nostalgia, sometimes in terms of progress, in an age of rapid industrialization around 1900. Kathy Geer explains further that as part of modernism, the democratic, bureaucratic, and liberal state was criticized as a soulless dystopia. And Kathy Geer's own work is on the history of archaeology in the late 19th century, when archaeologists were working on Greece on the Bronze Age. They were excavating the Palace of Knossos on Crete, and doing so, they were bringing to life ancient Greek legends. And what Kathy Geer emphasizes here is what she calls an archaizing impulse. She means by this a frantic search by archaeologists in the late 19th century, a search through the annals of the deep past for neo-primitive solutions to the problem of industrial capitalism. This threshold from an imagined past to the present is something that I am concerned with too. I also look at searches that people conducted around 1900, searches in the deep past for solutions to the problems of industrial capitalism. The past, in my case, usually does not go quite as far back as the past in Kathy Geer's case. I do look at people's solutions to the problems of industrial capitalism, but I don't call these solutions neo-primitive. For the time being, I call them pre-industrial. The people that I study go back to places and times in often imagined medieval and early modern Europe. One of the things that characterizes social groups in the past and in the present is their concern about their social status, how they express this concern, And there's also a set of expected behaviors and norms that they share and impose on each other. In my particular case, engineers and bourgeois elites during the Second Industrial Revolution to some degree shared such concerns, norms, and expectations. At the same time, and this is one of the things I'm engaged with most, engineers were not in an unambiguous way accepted as members of the bourgeoisie in ways that they wanted to be during the Second Industrial Revolution, or even today, one could say. That's a big question that's being discussed in engineering societies, in engineering departments at universities, and at other institutions nowadays, and we can talk about this later if we want. At the same time, I believe that many features of our society, our understanding of class elites, and also our ideas about the role of technology in society derive from ideas about how bourgeois society in Europe came into being, how it operates today, and whether and what parts of European bourgeois society were imported here to the United States, in particular through massive migration from Europe to the US from the 17th century onward. There was and has been traffic in the opposite direction too, of American bourgeois class ideas back to Europe. That's also an important history, but that is not my history today. So when I talk about this project about social order in early modern Europe, I do it in conjunction with what people in later periods said about this time and place. This goes back to Kathy Gear's idea. Early modern Europe, that is often defined as the time and place before the important revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, say 1300 to 1750. Historians distinguish early modern from modern societies by distinguishing, among other things, conflicts in them among social groups. More recent social conflicts are called class conflicts, as opposed to conflicts in earlier societies, for example, in estate societies or in court societies. Among the most influential people to study this, and whose vocabulary we still use, I guess you can guess it, were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The two of them right here, and this is them in the 1840s at the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, the newspaper that they were editing. Marx and Engels wrote their important works in the period between the mid-1840s and the 1880s. So they wrote their main work in a time after two important revolutions, the French and the American one, during another important revolution, the First Industrial Revolution, and just before a fourth one, the Second Industrial Revolution. This is the period that concerns me most, the latter one. It's important to mention, too, that they wrote their work before the next big surge of revolutions in the aftermath of World War I, among other places in Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany in 1917 and 1918. Those were revolutions whose leaders claimed that they were strongly influenced by writings of Marx and Engels. Among historians nowadays, it is common to distinguish very carefully between the legacy and influence of Marx and Engels themselves and the legacy and influence of those who shaped their ideas for political purposes. I guess in this room I don't have to emphasize this, but I want to mention it for the record. It becomes particularly important in the processes of industrialization right in that period. It was Marx and Engels who came up with a robust definition of the term class that has proven useful to historians and political theorists coming after them. And we owe in many ways to them our current common use of the term to talk about different groups in society, in particular in societies after the First Industrial Revolution. For Marx and Engels, the term is also part of their theory of history. It is part of a model of history that they developed and that supposedly enables us to make predictions about how history unfolds. That's one of the reasons that this is so important and has been so influential. This is no longer how we do history among professional historians, at least the predicting part. But my concern about renderings of pre-industrial pasts in times of rapid industrialization certainly touches on the many theories of history that were being developed in the middle of the 19th century. It was one of the things to do as a male intellectual in France or in Germany at the time. You would develop theories of culture and theories of history. So Friedrich Engels' Principles of Communism, published in 1847. It was published just before a series of failed revolutions all over Europe in 1848, a very famous year, 1848. And the revolutions were about working and life conditions, poverty, and very much about autocratic rule. The text also ended up as the foundation of the longer and much better known Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels co-authored. This, I imagine, this is well known, was a political pamphlet, and it's nowadays recognized as one of the world's most influential political documents altogether. But the earlier text first, by Engels, The Principles of Communism. This text, interestingly, is written as a catechism, so it's an explanation of a set of ideas. Catechisms usually present ideas that form a doctrine, and the catechism serves as a learning tool. The biggest examples for catechisms are usually religious teachings for children or for adult converts, often in Christianity, and they are typically written in the form of questions followed by answers to be memorized. Perhaps some of you have memories related to this. I certainly do have memories of catechisms. Martin Luther is the author I want to mention here. The practice of catechisms certainly has been represented and processed in paintings and in other art forms. Just want to show you a couple of examples here. Please note both the dates and the aesthetics of these representations of catechisms. So this is La Leçon du Catéchisme. This is from 1890, somewhere in rural France. So you have a very sort of pastoral setting here, right? A member of the clergy, and children who are reciting their catechisms. In the middle, I want to say, of the Second Industrial Revolution. Next one, a year after the end of, at the time, the biggest slaughter that the world had ever seen, the end of World War I. So it's an equally idyllic pastoral scenery. In this case, it is a woman. She is reading and rehearsing the catechism with a little girl. So the Catechism by Edith Hartree from 1919. The period and this whole pastoralism is something that I will be engaged with for the whole time tonight. So back to Engels and the Catechism. So Engels' Catechism on Communism contains 25 questions about communism, and Engels provides an answer to each of them. He discusses society, history, and economics. It naturally goes in small steps, this catechism, as we will see, and we will also see that the practices of reading and reciting and of dialogue are built right into the text, like in a catechism. This is what it starts with. What is communism? Communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. Next question. What is the proletariat? The proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital. The proletariat is the working class of the 19th century. I just want to ask you once again, put your mindset back to the 1840s and 1850s. It would be very fresh and very new things that he's rehearsing here. That might very well be that you recognize many ideas in this catechism. At the time, it was very much material that he would put into a catechism. Next step is a history lesson. Proletarians then have not always existed. No. There have always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor. But there have not always been workers and poor people living under conditions as they are today, 1847. There have not always been proletarians any more than there has always been free, unbridled competition. I just want to point out to you, there's a couple of more moments when Engels is very much engaged with the idea and concept of competition. The next question is again a historical question. How did the proletariat originate? This also requires a little longer answer, so I'm asking you to bear with me and with him for a moment. The proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the that is, the 18th century. This Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, etc. These machines, which were very expensive and could be bought only by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the former workers. In this way, all these industries fell, one after another, under the dominance of steam, machinery, and the factory system. But at the same time, they also fell into the hands of big capitalists, and their workers were deprived of whatever independence remained to them. A little further. In civilized countries at the present time, nearly all kinds of labor are performed in factories. This process has ruined the small handicraftsman, entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and two new classes have been created. These are the class of big capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already in most exclusive possession of all the means of subsistence and production. This is the bourgeois class or the bourgeoisie. Second, the class of the wholly propertyless, who are obliged to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in order to get in exchange the means of subsistence for their support. This is called the class of proletarians or the proletariat. The next question is, under what conditions does this sale of the labor of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place? I left this out for today, but the next one is interesting again. What working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution? And this question, this topic of beforeness, what was there before the Industrial Revolution? It's something very much engaged with. So what was there before? The working classes have always, according to the different stages of development of society, lived in different circumstances and had different relations to the owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the workers were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backward countries and even in the southern part of the United States. In the Middle Ages, they were the serfs of the land-owning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland, and Russia. The next questions are historical examples again. In what way do proletarians differ from slaves, and in what way do proletarians differ from serfs? I won't go into those today, but there are reference points in these answers at the time that would have been relevant for people at the time. Next question is, in what way do proletarians differ from handicraftsmen? And I would like to go into this once again, and I ask you to watch out, because there's a lesson of social mobility here between classes and another lesson on competition by Engels. So in what way do proletarians differ from handicraftsmen? In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past 18th century, is a proletarian at most temporarily. His goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist, or where freedom from guild restrictions has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts, nor yet to fierce competition. But as soon as the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away, and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois, or entering the middle class in general, or becoming a proletarian because of competition. In what way do proletarians then differ from manufacturing workers? And this is once more a historical narrative of loss, and I would like you to pay a little bit of attention of what is being lost here. The manufacturing worker of the 16th to the 18th century still had, with but few exceptions, an instrument of production in his own possession: his loom, the family spinning wheel, a little plot of land which he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker almost always lives in the countryside and in a more or less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. The proletarian lives for the most part in the city, and his relation to his employer is purely, I want to point that out, a cash relation. The manufacturing worker is, I want to say this again, emphasize this, is torn out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. And this purely cash relationship and to the landlord, and the relationship, patriarchal relationship to the landlord, and being torn out. These are things, again, I'll be concerned with for the rest of my talk. And I have one last bit of the catechism for you here. It's a bit more complex again, and I'd like to ask you to bear with me just once again. This is another history lesson. What were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and of the division of society into bourgeoisie and proletariat? So this is very much at the time for Engels, very recent history of the Industrial Revolution. He's asking what just happened in the last 20 years in the Industrial Revolution. So what were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and of the division of society into bourgeoisie and proletariat? First, he says, the lower and lower prices of industrial products totally destroyed the old system of manufacture and hand labor. Second, wherever big industries displaced manufacture, the bourgeoisie developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The bourgeoisie displaced the hitherto ruling classes, the aristocracy, the guild masters and their representative, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeoisie abolished the entailment of estates and made landed property subject to purchase of the nobility. It destroyed the power of the guild masters by abolishing guilds and handicraft privileges. And in their place, the bourgeoisie put competition. That is, a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being a lack of the necessary capital. The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on, the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal, and that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. The bourgeoisie proclaims itself to be the dominant political class, and this it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and the recognition of free competition, and in European countries takes the form of constitutional monarchy. There's a lot of stuff in here to contemplate. For me, today, this is specifically about narratives that portray the drama of industrialization and modernization just as they were happening. The change from pre-industrial times, in this case medieval and early modern Europe, to industrial times, right in the middle of Europe again. One could argue that such narratives as Engels produced it had to be composed at the time simply because they were needed as meaning-making devices ever since any revolution, and that people like Engels participated actively in this project. Again, these narratives of how places, Europe in particular, became industrial have become very well known, and I'm interested in some specific cases about where and how well known they were and how they were being used. I want to say a few more things now about early modern Europe to put a little bit in perspective what Engels is saying here and to help us understand better what engineers 50 years later were engaged with as they were talking about medieval and early modern Europe. So early modern societies broke down into different groups. They were often referred to as estates or corporations. The corresponding terms for the collective were a number, for example, estate society, corporate society, court society, or the society of orders. I brought you some pictures. Many of them are very cliched. I imagine you've seen a number of those here. So often we use the example from France and their three estates. So that the first estate is the clergy, second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is everyone else. I imagine many of you have seen this caricature, right? The third estate is carrying both clergy and nobility. So it's the third estate that is doing the work at literally feeding the first and second estate. I have a few more pictures with some differentiation, and I brought you more pictures so that we can indulge a little and take some time to look at these representations, both contemporary but also later on in popular versions. So this is another French version as well from the 13th century. So there's some Latin here, some English, and there's some German here as well. So the first one is those who pray, oratores, those who fight, bellatores, and those who work, laboratores. And I can't help, don't get over the fact that the estates, they rhyme in German. They are Lehrstand, Wehrstand, and Nährstand. So those who teach, those who fight, and those who feed everyone else. So this is another representation. I think I have a representation about the orders of medieval society. So here at the back, you have some kind of ruling figure and some kind of a court situation. Here you have burghers, die Bürger, the bourgeois folks. They're outside of the actual court, but they're doing important things and they wear hats. So they have they wear things that are not affordable to everyone. And these are the people who labor. It's usually the representation of agricultural labor, but other labor, maintenance of households, as well as early handicraft were important as well. And I'd like to show you a few more pictures, just once again, to indulge a little, take some time to take this in. I'd like to show you a richly decorated manuscript that was made sometime between 1412 and 1416. It's called The Very Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry. Again, I imagine a number of you have seen it before. It shows activities at the court of the Duke of Berry and his peasants for each month of the year. It's once again a representation of the Middle Ages that has become very popular to this day. And I can also maybe ask you to think about what kind of representation you have about the Middle Ages and where it comes from. Also note, as I'm going along, as I'm showing you a few pictures, there are always the appropriate zodiac signs for each month. Also note the relative size of the castle of the Duke that is in the background each time. And finally, what I have in mind when I look at such representations of the Middle Ages is not least a text such as the one by Friedrich Engels and related narratives that were created in the middle of the 19th century about this earlier past in Europe and the loss that had happened to people during industrialization. So there's one more representation. This is not yet the manuscript. I want to show you this one because it shows life and death and fair degree of violence here. So there's agricultural labor once again here, right? You can see how the patterns emerge of how to represent this. The folks here in the armor, they would usually be among the knights, and they are killing a member of the clergy right here. And there's a spatial segregation as well, right? This is the agricultural labor is outside of the castle, and there is an inside of the castle as well. So the Duke of Berry, New Year, right? This is January. There's gift exchange. The Duke is right here, and there's partying happening in his castle. March, sowing the fields, slowly beginning here. So the zodiac sign, fairly large castle here, and there is a laborer on the field. The representation is pretty good. There's pretty large fields. This is literally, if you talk to economic historians of the Middle Ages, these fields, they fed what was going on here in the castle. It's April. This is a young couple exchanging rings, but they are not the ones who labor on the fields, right? So they wear clothes, that are not affordable to folks who labor on the fields. And these are people who have time to exchange rings, think about intermarriage and such things. Once again, in May, you have young nobles riding in a procession. So there were various holidays, obviously, that had to be observed. And again, these people could afford horses and, again, nice clothes. In June, there is the beginning of the harvest. You have another emphasis on agriculture here. And again, a pretty big castle right here in the background. In July, the shearing of the sheep. I like this. I want to put this in because it's not just the agriculture, the working of the soil, but of course, it's animal husbandry going on as well. In August, you have falconry again that moves more in the direction of hobbies. You have the big castle here, people on horses, and these are often young people who are socializing with each other. That was an important thing to do at the time as well. Just threw this in because we just left September and got into October. The harvest of the grapes is a different set of agricultural techniques that are being represented here, and needless to say, look at the size of this castle in relation to the rest of the image. And then finally, in October, it's the tilling of the fields. There, you have the agricultural workers, in an unusually large size. They're a little smaller in all other representations, but in the month of October, they're actually rather bigger than usual. You have a plow here and things, various things. So the Middle Ages, a few more things about social stratification in the Middle Ages. What historians often first point out is the general structure of privilege, because that is so distinct from modern society. Liberties and inequality. Over time, 3 or more estates evolved. The nobility usually existed in a feudal order. Relationships were based on the holding of land in exchange for service or labor, and usually some kind of tax that would often exceed 90%. The second estate was the clergy. Those were the prominent members of that most privileged of corporate bodies, the Catholic Church. The third estate, as I said, was many different people. Urban merchants and patriarchs who wanted trading privileges for their companies, who wanted corporate rights, liberties, and a degree of self-government for their own cities and towns. There were peasants, free and unfree. There were journeymen and apprentices. There were small shop owners and artisans. Once again, the situation in France is most often used to illustrate this because in France, the third estate contained every French commoner, everyone who did not possess a noble title and was not ordained by the church. Once again, if we go around the room here, you ask yourselves, do I possess a noble title or have I ever been ordained by the church? The answer to both questions is no, you are a member of the third estate. Tells you how diverse that was, and also got them into trouble in France. So the third estate had considerable diversity, many different levels of wealth, many different professions and ideas: rural, provincial, urban residents, lowly beggars, struggling peasants, urban artisans, laborers, shopkeepers, but also commercial middle classes and the nation's wealthiest merchants and capitalists. There was also a wide variation across Europe, particularly in the peripheries of Europe, such as in places like Sweden or Hungary. But in particular, the higher estates, the clergy and the nobles, acquired over time an awareness of belonging to an estate. They became aware of their power vis-à-vis the monarch, and they developed a collective or a corporate sense of estate coherence. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel would later call this coherence or belonging self-consciousness. That was in his account of civil society and its relationship to the state. Hegel was among the first ones to distinguish in his theory of modern society, civil society from the state. And Hegel's idea of consciousness is a difficult but very critical notion, and it has been handed down to us not least through work by Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, and also, that's one of my favorites, it helped Jürgen Habermas to develop his idea of the structural transformation of the public sphere during the 18th and early 19th centuries. That is the period that I keep coming back to today. Habermas published his work on the structural transformation of the public sphere in 1962. That was barely 15 years after the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And like Marx's and Freud's work, Habermas's work turned out to be more influential than Hegel's work, in particular here in North America. All of these are important ideas for me once again because they are narratives about how European society became modern, and they are often heavily mediated, and ultimately engineers around 1900 ended up using such narratives. So the higher estates, clergy and nobility, once again, they acquire this awareness of belonging to an estate, the awareness of their power vis-à-vis the monarch, and they developed this collective or corporate sense of estate coherence that is a little elusive. But this is precisely what some engineers said they were after in the Second Industrial Revolution. Engineers wanted cohesion within their newly constituted professional group. They wanted equivalent status vis-à-vis traditional academic and cultural elites. These were their role models, and engineers mimicked such traditional elites by using the language of estates and the estate of society for themselves. Engineers described their profession as an estate, as a Stand, and I would even go as far as saying, at least for today, that engineers wanted a historical consciousness for themselves and their professional group in the Hegelian sense. I'll show you a couple of examples from engineering societies on this, but before this, I would like to go back once more to this very powerful term of the estate society, Ständegesellschaft. So during the period in Christian Europe, once again from the 12th or the 13th century to the late 18th or even early 19th century, so basically the period in which we just heard Engels speak. So during this period, the model of 3 or 4 or more estates became more and more of a legal reality, but there was also a corresponding social reality that was made up in functional distinctions, as we saw. I just want to show you this image once again with the rhyming Leerstand, Neerstand, Weerstand. So there was a functional distinction between those who cared for spiritual well-being, the clergy, those who fought the wars, the nobility, and the producers of food and goods, that was peasants and artisans. And I want to emphasize that in this idealized social order, each man, we're not talking about women here, that was a totally different story. So each man supposedly received his place, characterized by the complementarity of the 3 estates. Nobility protected clergy and peasants, clergy provided salvation to the lay people, and peasants in turn fed nobility and clergy. And people said that this order was understood to be unchanging and that it was willed by God. The French Revolution is usually taken to be the watershed of European societies from the early modern age to modernity, as imprecise and as simplified as this might be. But what happened was that the privileges of the nobility were formally abolished, peasants had been liberated legally for a while in small steps, state and church had gradually been separated legally and culturally, and the state had been secularized, and a lot of this had been happening through the Enlightenment in the 18th century. The estate society, which was explicitly based on legal inequality, was being transformed in its tendency into a society of individuals who are equal before the law as citizens of a nation state. We saw some of this in Engels as well. And this is, of course, one of the often told narratives of where our modern nation states come from, including the principle of the principle of equality of all citizens more or less before the law, and the rule of the law and only the law in government. And there's a further element to this that matters to me, another part of narrating how Western Europe first became modern and other parts of the world. Western Europe, so the narrative goes, became modern because the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, emancipated from the aristocracy. It's one of the key criteria with which historians and sociologists have tried to distinguish modern from traditional societies, usually starting in the late 19th century. Max Weber was one of them. So what did engineers around 1900 do with all of this, as they were trying to constitute themselves as a new profession and social group? There was a strong desire among them for upward social mobility. They engaged in efforts to become more visible as a new profession and new expertise. In the Second Industrial Revolution, they lobbied other existing elites and institutions, such as traditional universities, to be recognized as being on par with them, legally and culturally. And engineers engaged in sometimes open rivalry conversations in which they made their wishes, claims, and concerns explicit. And this kind of talk happened, among other places, in engineering associations. This is a society that was founded in 1909 in Germany as an elite society exclusively for academically trained engineers. So we have here the periodical of the Association of German Diploma Engineers. The word diplom is the word for advanced degrees in engineering. Also in the sciences, I actually have one of those degrees in physics. I'm allowed to call myself Diplom-Physikerin. Until recently, they had this degree. I don't think they actually have it in Germany these days. So a diploma engineer, which is what you had to be to become a member of this society, this kind of guy, would be a man who has a master's level degree in engineering. Just a few more images of this periodical. So you have a lot of heavy industry here. This is sort of what characterized the Second Industrial Revolution, both before, during, and after World War I. This is the kind of advertising you see in there. So this is at some point no longer for individual engineers, but it's clearly targeted towards those who go shopping on behalf of large corporations. Schmiedehammer, Gleisanlagen, and this kind of very specific. So we are selling this to you guys, and this is the front page in 1927. So again, try to imagine engineers in Germany at the time on their coffee table is this monthly periodical. How did these people then discuss their institutional and educational questions and issues? I just want to point you to this word here. And this is a rubric that comes up in each monthly periodical. It's called Bildungs- und Standesfragen. So you have the word Bildung, education, and you have the word Stand, estate, in here. And the terms Bildung and Stand indicated in particularly forceful ways in Germany the supremacy of humanistically trained upper civil servants who worked in the German state administration, but also in the church administration and at universities. The words capture the goals that engineers pursued in their quest for a social status that was on par with pre-industrial elites. Academically trained engineers were learning from their traditional bourgeois role models. They started using the language of estates for themselves. Senior members of the engineering profession lamented, for example, that younger engineers were lacking a suitable feeling for their estate, Standesempfinden, and they called their own estate of engineers Stand. They complained that younger engineers neglected to cultivate this feeling, and also the more senior engineers tried to define the purpose of their estate as one of setting political and economic and cultural agendas, both for the nation state and for the public sphere. There will be precisely two criteria for being members of traditional bourgeois classes: setting agendas in the nation state, setting agendas in the public sphere. So I have a few impressions for you once again about this word Stand and what engineers were doing as they were trying to appropriate the early modern and medieval estate society for themselves. So this is about the periodical of building up engineering as a Stand. So this is Berufsstand, it means profession. Stände, so it's actually a very modern word together with a very medieval and early modern word. This is building up the Association of German Diploma Engineers. There's something about the common good, about the totality of society that's always very important. Once again, it's one of the things that would distinguish you as a member of a bourgeois elite if you made some kind of a contribution to the totality of the public sphere or the state. And what do you need if you want to be in a state? You need an organization that makes you become a state. So this is a Standesorganisation. And that is once again from this engineering periodical. So you have once again the academic estate organization. They ask, young engineers, ask yourselves, what can I do for my estate? Like JFK style, right? Ask not what my estate can do for me, ask what you can do for the estate. And there's something here about true academic-hood. I just want to leave this with this wahres Akademikertum. That was also part of what engineers were trying to capture for themselves. No one would give it to them for free. So if you were an engineer in 1909 or 1922, you were not a member of the wahres Akademikertum. You had to do that yourself. So I feel their pain as I read these periodicals. There's something about education and subsistence of an academic engineering estate. Just once again, the reference to themselves was about a profession, but also an estate, and just once again, about salaries, right? Wages, compensation, and here's the word, right? The Hegelian Bewusstsein. So it's about so compensation and estate consciousness. So I always think about bringing that to the dean's office at the University of Pennsylvania, my own Hegelian consciousness, as a justification to get my salary. They're not listening to me, they don't know enough about medieval Europe. So in this regard, Germany constituted a specific case. The middle classes and the bourgeoisie in Germany diversified in the course of industrialization, just as it diversified in other Western countries. But in Germany, educational and money bourgeoisie remained more closely interwoven than elsewhere, Britain, France, certainly in the United States. And for this reason, the traditional, read pre-industrial bourgeois groups retained their authority for much longer in Germany, and these bourgeois groups were made up of academically trained men. They were members of the free professions and, once again, employees of the state and the church. Many historians have explored the history of this group, particularly after the Second World War. Among them are Fritz Ringer, obviously, and Wolfgang Mommsen. Mommsen, definitely a member of that bourgeoisie, calls these men the traditional bourgeoisie of dignitaries, das ältere Honoratiorenbürgertum. And German engineers aimed to become part precisely of this elite that was exemplified by this traditional bourgeoisie of dignitaries. The editor of the periodical, a man named Karl Weyer, also taught the history of technology at the Technical University in Darmstadt. And in his inaugural lecture at Darmstadt, he pleaded for teaching the cultural history of technology, my field no less, at technical universities to provide engineers with a humanistic canon that they needed to be competitive, once again, for these two things, for positions in the civil service and the state administration, and to be credible actors in the public sphere. And this is a quote from his inaugural lecture. In the future, the technician will increasingly have to engage in public life, in the administrations, parliaments, and government. A comprehensive cultivation or education can only help him here, and he can acquire this easiest through historical study of his field. Also, greater engagement with other professions that are more historically educated, I'm not sure if he's right there, the lawyer, the economist, the civil servant in the administration is facilitated by this. So the very literal way of trying to become like the others, the lawyers, the economists, and the civil servants. The tool for this is the study of history. And I would like to show you this one, once again, in German. It's just so beautiful. Immer mehr wird in Zukunft der Techniker sich im öffentlichen Leben betätigen müssen, in den Verwaltungen, den Volksvertretungen, in der Regierung. Da kann ihm eine weitgehende Bildung nur förderlich sein, und diese kann er sich von der geschichtlichen Betrachtung seines Faches ausgehend am leichtesten aneignen. Auch das Näherkommen an andere Berufe, die mehr geschichtlich erzogen sind, an den Juristen, den Volkswirt und Verwaltungsbeamten, wird dadurch erleichtert. A little more detail on how engineers targeted the state administration as a key place for employment for themselves. This is how I will close. One historian of engineering has called engineers' obsession at the time with the civil service as manic. This is exactly true. So this is about the legal education of the engineer who works in the state state administration, die juristische Ausbildung des Verwaltungsingenieurs. So when reading these periodicals, all one could think is that what engineers wanted to be was not engineers, they wanted to be civil servants. So the civil service in Germany was conventionally the place where bourgeois male elite identities were being formed and maintained since the early modern period, specifically during the reign of King Frederick William I in Prussia, which began in 1713. The Prussian model of government was to grow this small agricultural state of Prussia into a global military power by the late 18th century. It was also the forerunner of the German Empire, in which the Second Industrial Revolution happened, and the fascist state from 1933 to 1945 in Nazi Germany. It was then during the reign of Frederick the Great, it was 1740 to 1786, that educated men in Prussia finally ascended to the top of a very carefully balanced socio-political world. If you were an intellectual in the service of Frederick and the Prussian state, that meant that you were a man of honor. Frederick the Great was certainly a key political and military ruler in the 18th century. He wrote a political testament in 1752. Just a couple of quotes from that about the sovereign. The sovereign is the first servant of the state. He is well paid so that he can support the dignity of his quality, but it is required of him that he shall work effectively for the good of the state and direct at least the chief affairs with attention. He needs, of course, help. He cannot enter into all details, but he should listen to all complaints and procure prompt justice for those threatened by oppression. It's not bad for 1752. Of course, reality and rhetoric in Frederick's state were often at odds with each other, to say the least, but Frederick is credited with attempts to implement principles from the Enlightenment into the government of a state. Frederick established a comprehensive legal code that was unified across his territories. He installed principles of fairness and equality, due process, and the fight against corruption and abuse of power. And here is an engraving of Frederick and his ministers and his civil servants. The civil servants who put his legal code and other practices of government into practice, and they were the estate of civil servants, the Beamtenstand that modern engineers 150 years later wanted to mimic. So there's Fred right here in the middle. You can recognize him very well. And these are the men of honor around him, and they have expertise. And this was the role model. And I kept wondering for years, what are these engineers after? What are they grasping for? This is one of the models. And Frederick has something to say about his advisors. We have here the Directorate General, the Colleges of Justice, and the ministers of the cabinet, who daily submit their reports to the sovereign, with most detailed memoranda on the questions which call for his decision. In controversial or difficult questions, the ministers themselves set out the pros and cons, which makes it possible for the sovereign to take his decision at a glance, provided that he takes the trouble to read and understand the matter in question. It's difficult these days to think about government. So here we see a convergence of old school aristocratic and monarchical power and display on the one hand, and modern rule of the law and of expertise, technical expertise no less, on the other. And it is in this convergence that the fascination of Frederick's reign lies, also in his military success certainly, and the gains of territories. 150 years later, after Frederick's reign, around 1900, there continued to be a fascination with the convergence of old school types of elites whose roots supposedly went back into the Middle Ages, such as medieval knighthood, and the status and expertise of a new group of people, engineers, in the Second Industrial Revolution. The emergence of the bourgeoisie preceded industrialization, and therefore key aspects of the bourgeoisie, such as the formation of bourgeois identities and traits, the symbolic representation of these traits, the imagination of the bourgeoisie's historical and moral origins and virtues. So key aspects of the bourgeoisie were not rooted in the industrial age. I just want to mention here very quickly that this is really different here in the United States. In the United States, engineers around 1900, those who were born in the US, those who immigrated from bourgeois Europe, they were around 1900 busy industrializing this country, as you can see all over New Jersey, certainly. They were building industrial infrastructures from scratch. They were industrializing the country. They were electrifying the country. And in Europe, at the same time, engineers were up against the bourgeoisie that liked to emphasize its roots in pre-industrial eras and time-honored early modern social orders. And this demarcation was often in itself strong enough to exclude engineers, at least for the time being, from bourgeois classes. So engineers were not unambiguously accepted as members of social orders that preceded the industrial age. So they mimicked the behavior of traditional elites. They themselves gestured towards traditional social orders that they wanted to be part of. And in this way, not least, they kept an old Europe memory alive, a memory of a society in which everyone had his place according to the will of God, but in which no engineer had had a place before. Thank you.